In the summer of 1849, a traveling merchant stumbled upon something in the backwoods of Georgia that would haunt him until his dying breath. What he found at Devil's Creek wasn't just bodies. It was something far worse. Something that made seasoned lawmen refuse to speak of it ever again. And the few who did, they all met the same mysterious end within a year. This is the true story they tried to erase from history. The story of the Blackwood bloodline. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some secrets should stay buried. But before we descend into the darkness of Devil's Creek, if you're fascinated by true mysteries and dark historical secrets, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. According to YouTube, only 23% of you watching are actually subscribed. Help us reach 100K by becoming part of our mystery community. Now, let's begin. The year was 1849, and Thomas Whitmore was a seasoned merchant who had traveled every dusty road and forgotten trail across the American South. He had seen poverty, disease, and the brutal realities of frontier life. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him in the dense pine forests of northern Georgia, in a place the locals called Devil's Creek. Thomas had taken a shortcut through the backwoods, trying to reach Dahlonega before nightfall. The California gold rush had started that very year, and he was carrying supplies he hoped to sell to prospectors passing through Georgia on their way west. The wagon path was overgrown, barely visible beneath the choking kudzu and wild brambles. The August heat was suffocating, and an unnatural silence hung over the forest. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just silence. That's when he smelled it, a sickly, sweet odor that made his stomach turn. Death. He'd smelled it before, but this was different. This was old death mixed with something else, something wrong. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop and listened. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural moaning coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. His horse whinnied and pulled against the reins, desperate to turn back. But Thomas, against every instinct screaming at him to flee, tied his horse to a tree and walked toward the sound. He pushed through the thick underbrush, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth near the creek bed. And then he saw it, a structure. At first, he thought it was just a collapsed cabin, the kind you'd find scattered throughout these forgotten hollows. But as he got closer, he realized this was no ordinary homestead. The building was partially underground, built into the hillside like a root cellar, but much larger. The roof had caved in on one side, and through the opening, Thomas could see inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were cages, crude, handmade cages constructed from stripped tree branches and iron chains. And in those cages were people, or what was left of them. Thomas counted 6 bodies, all in various stages of decomposition. But these weren't prisoners who had been locked up and forgotten. These people had been kept alive. There were bowls of rotten food, buckets of stagnant water, piles of filthy rags that might have once been bedding. But it was the living that truly horrified him. In the corner of the underground room, huddled together like frightened animals, were 3 figures, 2 adults and 1 child. When they saw Thomas, they didn't call for help. They didn't cry out in relief. Instead, they scrambled backward, making that same inhuman moaning sound he'd heard from the path. Thomas stepped closer, and that's when he saw their faces in the dim light filtering through the collapsed roof. These weren't just malnourished or diseased people. There was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with them. Their features were distorted, compressed, as if their skulls had been molded incorrectly. Their eyes were too close together, their jaws protruded at unnatural angles, and their hands were twisted into claw-like shapes. The child looked to be about 10 years old, but their body was stunted, barely 3 feet tall, with a head that seemed too large for their frame. Thomas, a God-fearing man who prided himself on Christian charity, felt his compassion battling with an overwhelming sense of revulsion. These people needed help, but something deep in his primitive brain was screaming at him that something was terribly, terribly wrong here. Can you understand me? Thomas asked, his voice shaking. Who did this to you? The older male figure stopped moaning and tilted his head, studying Thomas with eyes that held a disturbing intelligence despite their physical deformities. Then, in a voice that was thick and slurred but unmistakably human, he spoke 3 words that would echo in Thomas's nightmares for the rest of his life. We did this. Before Thomas could process what that meant, he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. He spun around to see a massive figure emerging from the forest. The man, if you could call him that, stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through the doorway of the underground structure. His face bore the same distorted features as the people in the cages, but more pronounced, more grotesque. In his hands he carried an axe. Thomas ran. He crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his face and clothes, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him he could hear the giant's heavy breathing, the sound of the axe whistling through the air. Thomas made it to his horse, cut the reins with his knife, and galloped away faster than he'd ever ridden in his life. He didn't stop until he reached the town of Dalunga, where he burst into the sheriff's office, wild-eyed and incoherent, babbling about monsters and cages and Devil's Creek. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Coleman Briggs, had heard plenty of tall tales from travelers who'd had too much whiskey. But something about Thomas's terror was genuine. The man had soiled himself. His face was bleeding, and his eyes held the unmistakable look of someone who had seen something that broke their understanding of the world. Sheriff Briggs assembled a posse of 12 men, including the town doctor, Samuel Hendricks. They rode out at first light, following Thomas's directions. The merchant refused to go back, no matter how much they pressed him. He gave them detailed directions, took his payment for the supplies, and left Georgia that very day. Sheriff Briggs would later learn that Thomas Whitmore died less than a year later in South Carolina, found hanging in his barn. The coroner ruled it suicide, but Thomas's wife insisted he'd been murdered. She said her husband had been receiving letters, strange letters written in a cramped, barely literate hand, that said only one thing over and over: you shouldn't have come to the creek. The posse found the underground structure exactly where Thomas had described. In the daylight, it looked even more horrifying. The building had clearly been there for decades, slowly expanded over the years, dug deeper into the hillside. Around it were other structures, including what appeared to be a main cabin about 50 yards away, hidden behind a thick grove of pine trees. Dr. Hendricks examined the bodies in the cages. What he found defied medical explanation. All 6 bodies showed signs of severe genetic abnormalities, the kind he'd only read about in medical journals from Europe. Conditions with names like mandibular prognathism and craniosynostosis. But these weren't random deformities. They were consistent across all the bodies, suggesting something he didn't want to acknowledge: generations of inbreeding. But it was what they found in the main cabin that truly unveiled the horror of Devil's Creek. Cabin was surprisingly well maintained on the inside, with crude furniture, a functional fireplace, and shelves lined with preserved foods. On one wall hung a large piece of slate, the kind used in schoolhouses. On this slate, drawn in white chalk, was a family tree. At the top were 2 names, Ezekiel Blackwood and Mercy Blackwood. The date beside their names read 1791. Below them, the tree branched out, but not in the way family trees normally do. The same names appeared over and over again. Ezekiel married Mercy. Their son, Josiah, married his sister, Temperance. Their children married each other. Their grandchildren married each other. For 58 years, the Blackwood family had been marrying exclusively within their own bloodline. Sheriff Briggs stared at the family tree in horror, "Dear God," he whispered, "they've been breeding like livestock." "Doctor?" Hendricks was studying the chalk marks more closely, his medical mind trying to make sense of the implications. "This explains the deformities. After generations of this, the bloodline would become so concentrated with recessive genes that..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but there was more. Beside the family tree were entries written in the same cramped handwriting that Thomas Whitmore had described in those threatening letters. They were entries, almost like diary entries, but they read more like religious doctrine. One entry read, "The blood must stay pure. The blood must stay in the family. Outsiders are sin. Outsiders are poison. The curse will come if the blood is mixed." Another read, "Ezekiel saw the light. Ezekiel knew the truth. We are chosen. We are perfect. The world will not understand." And the most disturbing entry, dated just 3 weeks before the posse arrived. "3 more have the weakness. They cannot work. They cannot breed. They must go to the keeping place. The blood will strengthen without them. The blood will be pure again." The keeping place. That's what they called the underground structure with the cages. This wasn't a prison for outsiders or enemies. This was where the Blackwood family put their own members who were too damaged by generations of inbreeding to be useful anymore. They weren't killing them outright, but they were letting them die slowly out of sight. Sheriff Briggs and his men searched the area and found evidence of at least 15 people living on the property recently. There were sleeping areas in the cabin and in 2 smaller outbuildings. There were clothes, tools, and, disturbingly, toys that suggested there were children in the family. But where was everyone? The only people Thomas had seen were the 3 in the cages and the giant with the axe. Where were the other Blackwoods? They got their answer as the sun began to set. As the posse was preparing to head back to town, they heard singing. It was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond the creek. The voices were discordant, off-key, but unmistakably human. They were singing a hymn, but the words were wrong, garbled, like someone had learned the song by ear and changed it without understanding what the words meant. Sheriff Briggs made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He ordered the posse to investigate. They followed the singing deeper into the woods, where the trees grew so thick that even in late afternoon, it was nearly dark. They came to a clearing where they found the rest of the Blackwood family. 15 people, ranging from what appeared to be elderly adults to small children, were gathered in a circle around a pit. In the center of that circle was a wooden pole, and tied to that pole was a young woman. She was screaming. She was pregnant, visibly so, her belly swollen with what must have been a late-term pregnancy, and the Blackwoods were preparing to set her on fire. "Stop, in the name of the law!" Sheriff Briggs shouted, raising his rifle. The singing stopped. 15 pairs of eyes turned to look at the posse. In that moment, Sheriff Briggs realized they had made a terrible mistake. These weren't helpless, deformed victims. These were predators, and the posse had just walked into their territory. The giant from Thomas's description stepped forward, still carrying his axe, but he wasn't alone. 3 other men, all bearing the same grotesque features and massive builds, emerged from the tree line behind the posse. They had been circled. They had been herded here deliberately. The blood must stay pure. The giant said in that same thick, slurred voice, "You don't understand. You can't understand. She betrayed the blood." One of the posse members, a young man named Daniel Marsh, made the connection. "The woman, she's pregnant with an outsider's child. That's why you're doing this." The Blackwoods didn't answer. They didn't need to. The family tree, the generations of inbreeding, the religious fervor in those diary entries, it all made horrible sense. The young woman tied to the pole had somehow gotten pregnant by someone outside the family. And in the twisted logic of the Blackwood clan, this was the ultimate sin, the ultimate contamination of their pure bloodline. What happened next was pure chaos. Sheriff Briggs fired a warning shot into the air, demanding they release the woman. The Blackwoods charged, the posse fired. In the confusion, someone knocked over a lantern, and the dry grass around the pit caught fire. The woman's screams grew louder as the flames spread. 3 of the posse members, including Daniel Marsh, fought their way to the pole and cut the woman free. She collapsed into their arms, barely conscious. The rest of the posse was engaged in a brutal close quarters fight with the Blackwood men. Despite their deformities, or perhaps because of them, the Blackwoods fought with savage strength and seemed impervious to pain. By the time Sheriff Briggs regained control of the situation, 3 of his men were dead, 5 more were injured, and 4 Blackwood family members lay dead or dying. The rest had vanished into the forest, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts. The posse carried the pregnant woman back to Dalunga. Dr. Hendricks worked through the night, treating her burns and trying to keep her alive. She survived, barely, but she never spoke a coherent word again. Whatever she had endured with the Blackwood family had broken her mind completely. She gave birth 3 weeks later to a healthy baby boy. The child was immediately taken by the church and sent to an orphanage in Atlanta, his origins kept secret. The woman, who they later identified as Rebecca Tallow, a seamstress who had disappeared from a neighboring county 6 months earlier, lived for another 2 years in a state hospital before dying of pneumonia. To her last day, she would wake up screaming, clawing at her arms as if trying to remove something from her skin. The nurses said she kept repeating 2 words over and over: the blood, the blood. Sheriff Briggs wanted to organize a larger expedition, bring in the state militia, and root out the remaining Blackwood family members. But he encountered resistance from an unexpected source: the local government itself. 2 days after the incident at Devil's Creek, Sheriff Briggs was visited by 3 men from the state capitol. They wore expensive suits and carried documents with official seals. They told him, in very clear terms, that the Blackwood situation was to be handled quietly. Why? Because the Blackwood family wasn't just an isolated clan of inbred hermits. They were connected to one of the founding families of Georgia. Ezekiel Blackwood, the patriarch who had started the bloodline back in 1791, was the younger brother of Thaddeus Blackwood, a war hero from the Revolutionary War, and one of the original landowners in northern Georgia. Thaddeus had gone on to have a normal family, normal children, and his descendants included judges, businessmen, and politicians. Ezekiel, on the other hand, had always been strange. According to family records, he'd been injured in the war, took a blow to the head that changed his personality. He became obsessed with purity, with keeping bloodlines clean, with bizarre religious ideas about chosen families. He married his cousin Mercy, against the family's wishes, and disappeared into the wilderness around Devil's Creek. The main Blackwood family assumed Ezekiel's line had died out decades ago. Now the revelation that Ezekiel's descendants had not only survived, but had been practicing incestuous breeding for over half a century, was a scandal that could destroy the reputation of one of Georgia's most prominent families. Political careers were at stake. Business fortunes could be lost, so the decision was made at the highest levels. The Devil's Creek incident would be buried. Sheriff Briggs was ordered to file a report stating that he had encountered a group of mountain bandits who had attacked his posse. The bodies recovered were to be buried in unmarked graves. The cabin and structures at Devil's Creek were to be burned to the ground, and the land was to be purchased by the state and declared off limits. The pregnant woman's rescue was to be recorded as an unrelated incident. Sheriff Briggs protested. He argued. He threatened to go to the newspapers. That's when they showed him the photographs. Someone had been documenting the Blackwood situation long before Thomas Whitmore stumbled upon it. There were photographs of the family tree, of the caged people, of documents that would prove the state had known about the Blackwoods for years and had done nothing. If Sheriff Briggs went public, these photographs would disappear, and he would be painted as a liar, a conspiracist, or worse, as someone who had fabricated the entire story to cover up the murder of innocent citizens. His career would be over, his reputation destroyed, and the families of the 3 men who died during the raid would receive no compensation, no recognition of their sacrifice. Briggs caved. He signed the false report. He watched as workers from the state came and burned Devil's Creek to the ground. He stood by as the bodies were buried in the middle of the night, in a mass grave with no markers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of who they were or how they had lived. But Sheriff Briggs did one thing they didn't know about. He kept a copy of everything. The original family tree, his detailed notes, sketches Dr. Hendricks had made of the deformities, statements from posse members. He hid these documents in a metal box and buried it on his own property, with instructions in his will that it should be opened 50 years after his death. Coleman Briggs died in 1876, a broken man who never spoke publicly about Devil's Creek again. His will was executed, but the metal box was never found. His property changed hands several times over the decades, and whatever secrets he buried went with him. Or so everyone thought. In 1923, during the construction of a new road through what used to be Briggs's property, workers unearthed a metal box. Inside were all the documents Sheriff Briggs had preserved. A local historian, a man named Marcus Webb, obtained the documents and began researching the Devil's Creek story. What Webb discovered was chilling. Not only had the Blackwood family existed exactly as Briggs described, but they hadn't been completely wiped out in 1849. There were records, hidden in the archives of the state hospital, of people with severe genetic deformities being admitted throughout the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, all from northern Georgia, all found in the woods near Devil's Creek, all unable to speak or identify themselves. Webb found census records from 1860 that listed a family in the Devil's Creek area with the surname Blackwell, clearly a variation of Blackwood. The family consisted of 6 people, all listed as mentally deficient by the census taker. By the 1870 census, the Blackwell family had disappeared entirely. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Webb found property records showing that the land around Devil's Creek had been purchased in 1852 by a private buyer who subdivided it and sold it off to various individuals, all of whom happened to share the surname Blackwood or variations of it. These weren't members of the wealthy Blackwood family from the city. These were different Blackwoods. Blackwoods with no official birth records. Blackwoods who appeared in documents, but left no other trace of their existence. Webb theorized that the surviving members of Ezekiel's bloodline had scattered after the 1849 raid, but had regrouped over the following years. They'd learned to hide better, to avoid attention, to move when outsiders got too close. They were still out there, still breeding within their isolated gene pool, still following Ezekiel's mad vision of purity. Marcus Webb published his findings in a small historical journal in 1925. 3 months later, his house burned down with him inside. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a knocked-over kerosene lamp. But Webb's neighbors reported seeing figures in the woods around his property in the days before the fire. Tall figures, moving figures that didn't walk quite right. All of Webb's research, including Sheriff Briggs's original documents, were destroyed in the fire. Only his published article remained, and it was largely dismissed by mainstream historians as sensationalized folklore. Now, you might be thinking this is just a historical curiosity, a dark chapter from America's past that has no relevance to the modern world. But that's where you'd be wrong. In 1983, a team of genetic researchers from the University of Georgia conducted a study on inherited genetic disorders in isolated rural communities. They were looking for populations with higher than average rates of conditions like Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, and other genetic disorders. What they found in northern Georgia shocked them. In a region encompassing about 50 square miles around what used to be Devil's Creek, there was a statistically impossible concentration of rare genetic disorders. The rate of severe birth defects was nearly 30 times the national average. The rate of certain recessive genetic conditions was even higher. But here's the strange part. There was no identifiable population causing these numbers. The researchers couldn't find a single family or community with these conditions. The hospital records showed individuals usually found alone or in pairs, brought in by anonymous people who would drop them off and disappear. No names, no family history, no way to trace where they came from. One of the lead researchers, Dr. Patricia Holloway, became obsessed with the mystery. She spent years trying to trace the origins of these patients, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing old-timers who spoke in vague terms about them folks in the deep woods, but would never say more. In 1991, Dr. Holloway wrote a paper theorizing that there might be an isolated population still living in the remote areas of northern Georgia, possibly descendants of families who had been practicing endogamy, marriage within an extremely limited gene pool, for over a century. Her paper suggested this could be a remnant of the Blackwood bloodline from the 1849 incident, which by then was considered more legend than history. Her paper was rejected by every major journal. Her colleagues distanced themselves from her. The university quietly asked her to retire. Dr. Holloway became a pariah in the academic community, branded as a conspiracy theorist. But then, in 1997, something happened that vindicated her research, at least partially. A group of hikers in the remote wilderness area near the old Devil's Creek site found a dwelling built into the side of a hill. It was crude but functional, clearly inhabited recently. Inside were supplies, food stores, and disturbing evidence of human habitation. Clothing in various sizes, including children's clothing, toys made from carved wood, and on one wall, scratched into the wood with a knife, a family tree. The hikers reported their discovery to the Forest Service, which investigated along with local police. By the time they arrived at the site 2 days later, it had been abandoned. But forensic analysis of the site confirmed that multiple people had been living there, possibly for years. DNA evidence collected from the site showed extremely high levels of genetic similarity among the inhabitants, consistent with multiple generations of close inbreeding. But here's the most disturbing finding. The DNA matched samples that had been collected from those anonymous patients with genetic disorders who had appeared at hospitals over the decades. The people living in that hidden dwelling were directly related to them. The bloodline had survived. It was still out there. A massive search was organized involving state police, forest rangers, and volunteers. They combed thousands of acres of wilderness. They found evidence of other temporary shelters, signs of people moving through the forest, even what appeared to be old grave sites. But they never found the people themselves. Dr. Holloway was brought in as a consultant. Now, in her late 60s, she spent 3 months working with the search team. In her final report, she estimated that there could be anywhere from 20 to 50 individuals living in the remote wilderness of northern Georgia, all descendants of the original Blackwood bloodline. She calculated that after 150 years of continuous inbreeding, the genetic damage would be catastrophic. Most children born into such a population would have severe physical and cognitive impairments. Life expectancy would be extremely low, but she also noted something terrifying: adaptation. In isolated populations under extreme genetic pressure, evolution can work in strange ways. While most genetic diseases would proliferate, certain traits might become fixed in the population. The Blackwood descendants might have developed unique physical characteristics, adaptations to their isolated lifestyle. They had survived for 150 years in the wilderness, avoiding detection, avoiding integration with the outside world. That took intelligence, planning, and skills that shouldn't be possible for a population suffering from severe inbreeding depression. Unless, Dr. Holloway theorized, they were supplementing their gene pool. Unless they were occasionally bringing in outsiders, and the fate of those outsiders based on the 1849 incident with Rebecca Tallow was too horrific to fully contemplate. The search was officially called off in 1998. The area was designated as protected wilderness, and public access was heavily restricted. Officially, this was for environmental protection. Unofficially, the state didn't want anyone else stumbling upon what might be out there. Dr. Holloway died in 2003. In her personal papers found after her death was a final note about the Blackwood bloodline. It read, "I believe they're still out there. I believe they've learned to hide so well that we'll never find them unless they want to be found. And God help us if that day ever comes. Because after generations of isolation, after generations of genetic damage and survival against impossible odds, what emerges from Devil's Creek won't be entirely human anymore. It will be something else. Something we created by driving them into the darkness and leaving them there. The Blackwood curse isn't what they did to themselves. It's what we allowed them to become." In the fall of 2019, just months before the world changed with the pandemic, there were reports of unusual activity near Devil's Creek. Hikers reported seeing figures watching them from the tree line. Trail cameras set up by wildlife researchers captured images of people, or things that looked like people, moving through the forest at night. The images were always blurry, always just out of focus, but they showed figures with unusual proportions, unusual gaits. And then, in March 2020, as the world locked down and the forests emptied of visitors, the sightings stopped entirely. Whatever was out there retreated deeper into the wilderness, perhaps seeing the pandemic as we did, a time to isolate, to hide, to wait. Local forest rangers report that certain areas near Devil's Creek remain off limits, though the official reason given is environmental sensitivity. Unofficially, rangers are instructed never to go into those areas alone, never to go there after dark, and if they see anyone in those restricted zones, to report it immediately without making contact. The Blackwood bloodline, if it still exists, has become something of an urban legend in northern Georgia. Local teenagers dare each other to hike into the Devil's Creek wilderness. True crime podcasters speculate about the Georgia inbred clan. But the people who live in the towns nearest to Devil's Creek don't talk about it. They don't joke about it. They don't go into those woods because they know the stories, the real stories. The stories of people who went into those woods and came back changed, or didn't come back at all. Thomas Whitmore saw something in 1849 that haunted him to his grave. Share, if Coleman Briggs tried to expose the truth and was silenced. Marcus Webb got too close to the secret and paid with his life. Dr. Patricia Holloway dedicated her career to understanding the mystery and died believing it was far from over. The Blackwood curse isn't that they existed. It's that they still exist. Somewhere in the deep woods of Georgia, where the creeks run dark and the trees grow so thick that sunlight never touches the ground, Ezekiel's legacy continues. The blood stays pure. The blood stays in the family. And the curse, like the bloodline itself, goes on and on and on, generation after twisted generation. What they found at Georgia's Creek in 1849 wasn't just a family practicing incest. It was the birth of something new. Something that shouldn't exist, something that evolution and nature should have destroyed decades ago, but it survived, it adapted, it learned to hide. And it's still out there, watching from the darkness of Devil's Creek, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too far from the trail. The next person whose blood might be added to the family tree. The next person who will learn, too late, that the Blackwood bloodline isn't a curse from the past. It's a curse that's still very much alive. So what do you think? Is the Blackwood bloodline still out there? Or is this just an urban legend that grew from a dark historical incident? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this story as disturbing as I did, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. We have more terrifying true stories coming your way, including the mystery of the Michigan burial ground and the disappearing town of Centralia. You won't want to miss those. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe stay out of the deep woods of northern Georgia. The blood must stay pure.